Sintetizar el alma humana hasta hacer con su obra íconos del espíritu humano. Ahondar en las pasiones e impulsos del hombre. Hacerse eterno con la letra. En 2016 se conmemoran los 400 años de la muerte de William Shakespeare. ¿Cómo el bardo de Avon ha logrado trascender el tiempo? ¿Qué lo ha llevado a florecer en las tierras y las lenguas más remotas?
I think ultimately it's down to the power of the story. He tells fantastic stories, and these are stories that encompass the entirety of the human imagination, the human emotion, the human intellect, love, tragedy, death, revenge, magic, fantasy, all sorts of basic human emotions and basic situations. But he's an extraordinary storyteller. Now there have been other great storytellers in the Spanish language, in the English language, in all languages. But somehow Shakespeare, given that he died 400 years ago and actually never apparently went abroad, had an extraordinary worldview. So it's not only the power of the story, but the power of the character and the power of the global imagination, I think.
And I think to think of Shakespeare now as something to do with British heritage, it doesn't really work anymore. I think Shakespeare's stopped being British and become a kind of international writer for the world. I don't say that just for a kind of soundbite or to be glib. I think that, you genuinely have whole dramatic traditions that have grown out of Shakespeare in a certain country, have grown out of Shakespeare's plays being translated, and the dramatic tradition has gone off in a certain different way.
But what is undoubted is that the themes that Shakespeare addresses, the way he looks at the important parts of human life, find relevance today. I was in Stratford very recently, and Gregory Doran, who's the artistic director of the Royal Shakespeare Company, described it as Shakespeare's work being like a magnet that draws the iron filings of all the issues that are current today towards it. And you see Shakespeare providing useful access points, whether you're talking about the big political issues, whether you're talking about power, whether you're talking about leadership, but also the things that are important to us personally, and about love and betrayal and jealousy. And that is extraordinary, actually. And the breadth of the archetypes that he addresses and presents is quite unparalleled, I think, by anybody in the world.
Pero no solo ha sido el conocimiento del alma humana. Shakespeare nació para ahondar en la lengua inglesa, para reivindicar el idioma en el que escribe, para crear no solo piezas únicas, sino frases que definen el carácter del ser humano.
Patrick Spottiswoode, who's one of our partners on our programme around translation, who's the director of education at Shakespeare's Globe in London. He talks very interestingly about how Shakespeare took English, which was, at the time he started writing, regarded particularly by the sort of French and Spanish and German writers and speakers. English was regarded as a rather rough and ready language, a language of action, a language of getting things done, but not a language of poetry. And what Shakespeare did was he took English and he turned it into a language of poetry and a language of tragedy and romance.
Shakespeare Lives es el programa que ha lanzado el British Council para conmemorar el 400 aniversario luctuoso de William Shakespeare, y es precisamente aquí en el Teatro The Globe donde se encuentra el punto neurálgico, el punto de cruce entre la vida y obra de este escritor.
En la ribera sur del río Támesis, en Southwark, junto a la orilla, se localiza una estructura de forma circular, de estilo isabelino. Shakespeare's Globe es una reconstrucción del teatro original, realizada a partir de referencias académicas.
In 1599, Shakespeare's company relocated from Shoreditch on the other side of the river to Bankside, where we are now, and a Globe Theatre went up kind of behind me, just on the other side of where our Globe Theatre is, in 1599, and then that burnt down during a performance of Henry VIII in 1613, and then there were a couple more iterations of the Globe Theatre.
Fue en 1970 cuando el actor y director Sam Wanamaker estableció la fundación Shakespeare Globe para la reconstrucción de este edificio.
But then there was nothing here, you know, for centuries there was nothing here. And Sam Wanamaker, who was an American, a Hollywood actor in America, came to this area of London and I think kind of expected to find some kind of great monument like we have today to what Shakespeare was doing, to the fact that Shakespeare was living here and working here. But he didn't, he just found a sign on the wall that said, oh, you know, Shakespeare lived here and worked here. And he started fundraising and did a, you know, incredible fundraising effort over many, many years. And finally in 1997, we finished the building of this replica. Sam Wanamaker died in 1993, but he saw that the building was going up and that it was going to happen. So it's a phenomenal achievement.
Una placa recuerda la contribución de Wanamaker. Shakespeare's Globe cuenta con un escenario de madera, al igual que el espacio destinado al público, muy al estilo de como lo vio William Shakespeare.
And everyone's enjoying this experience together, and we're not kind of sitting down in the dark in red velvet seats. We're standing up or looking at each other, laughing together, crying together. And so I think that something in the architecture of this building itself, which is an architecture that Shakespeare would have recognized, is kind of inherently democratic, and that feels really exciting and really progressive.
A solo unas cuadras de The Shakespeare Globe se encuentra la locación original del Teatro de Globe. Fue aquí donde William Shakespeare estrenó algunas de sus obras como Hamlet y Otelo. Ahora se conmemora con una placa en esta locación, de la cual solamente queda referencia histórica.
El predio ahora es ocupado por viviendas y un estacionamiento. Además de la placa, algunos carteles dan cuenta de la historia centenaria del lugar. Pero no solo son los muchos lugares en Londres donde Shakespeare dejó huella. También existe, aunque poca, evidencia documental.
El patrimonio bibliográfico y cultural del pueblo británico está resguardado precisamente aquí, en la afamada British Library. Y es aquí donde también William Shakespeare tiene un espacio muy especial. ¿Se imaginan poder conocer el puño y letra de William Shakespeare en un texto? O bien también descubrir quién fue el primer actor de color que interpretó uno de esos personajes. Estas son las oportunidades que nos brinda la exposición Shakespeare in 10 Acts.
La exposición inicia con 2 de las 3 únicas páginas que existen con la letra de William Shakespeare. Se trata del libro de Sir Thomas More, en donde se narra la historia del ilustre abogado sentenciado a muerte por no reconocer al rey Enrique VIII como líder de la Iglesia de Inglaterra. La exposición Shakespeare in 10 Acts cuenta con 10 núcleos temáticos que corresponden a igual número de montajes emblemáticos de la obra del bardo. Uno de ellos muestra el retrato de Ira Aldrich, el primer actor de color en interpretar un personaje de Shakespeare, Otelo, en 1826. Pero no solo fueron las barreras raciales. En 1899, la actriz Sarah Bernhardt protagonizó una célebre interpretación de Hamlet. De aquel montaje se exhibe un cráneo que Bernhardt recibió del escritor francés Víctor Hugo. Quizá uno de los montajes más vanguardistas de la obra de Shakespeare es el realizado por Peter Brook. Su versión de Sueño de una noche de verano, de 1970, es minimalista y emplea elementos circenses.
Es Londres y a todo lo largo del Reino Unido y del mundo que el British Council ha organizado actividades para conmemorar este 400 aniversario. Y desde luego no puede faltar Stratford-upon-Avon, una comunidad que se encuentra a unos kilómetros al noroeste de esta metrópoli y que es el lugar de nacimiento de William Shakespeare.
Poco más de 160 kilómetros separan a la capital británica del pueblo natal del célebre dramaturgo. Ahí se estableció en 1847 The Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, una fundación destinada a preservar el patrimonio vinculado al bardo.
We have 5 sites within our portfolio here in Stratford and the surrounding areas of Stratford. Of course, the birthplace where Shakespeare was born, where his parents lived, where he grew up, and obviously where he went to school from in the heart of Stratford-upon-Avon, actually sitting on Henley Street, was the first one to be preserved. The trust has been in existence since 1847. And then over time we have gained other properties that have a connection to the Shakespeare story.
Debemos nuestra vida a Dios, pero si la pagamos hoy, no la deberemos mañana. Una cita de William Shakespeare que bien define su postura y su contribución. La primera bocanada de aire de este autor inglés se dio justo aquí, en esta casa en Stratford-upon-Avon.
In this room here, where his father and William sat, we see a splendid 4-poster bed, a sign of wealth, a sign of status in one of the grandest rooms of the house. We are also walking on the original floor from the 1530s, walking in the footsteps of Mr. William Shakespeare. This was an incredible status symbol, to have a bed on display that's not being used in a bedroom. It was remarkable for the time. Even the placement of the bed right next to the windows, so when people are walking past they can see in your home and see your wealth. Coming into the dining room or the hall at William Shakespeare's home, we can see the table set out for a very high status family, with glass on the tables, with good food, good wine, as we walk through the hall and into the workshop where William Shakespeare's father worked as a glove maker. Coming from the hall through the cross passage into the workshop where William Shakespeare's father worked as a glove maker. William Shakespeare helped his father in here, and what's incredibly important, in the complete works of William Shakespeare, more than 70 references to glove making. bringing William Shakespeare close to the family trade. Bringing people into the family bedrooms, the two rooms, the very room where William Shakespeare slept as a young boy, following through into the girls' bedroom, his sisters playing and laughing in this room. As we walk through William's bedroom, we go into one of the most important rooms in history, the room where Mr. William Shakespeare was born. Entering the room here where William Shakespeare was born, one of the most famous rooms in the world today. The bard born in this room in 1564, and as he famously wrote, mewling and puking in the nurse's arms. Leaving the birth room into the extension at the back of the house, added by William Shakespeare himself in 1603. This is when William started to invest his money, building an extension onto the house to lease the building out as a tavern, as a drinking parlour, and as a place for people to stay. This was known as the Maidenhead Tavern. A little later on, Ben Jonson, the poet and William's friend, added the Swan. William Shakespeare known as the Sweet Swan of Avon, the Swan of Stratford. Going down the stairs at the back of the house, this is the drinking parlour where William would have sat once he came back from London. A wonderful drinking chair as we walk into the kitchens and the parlours just here. Opening up into a wonderful room. This is the Swan and Maidenhead. This is where people came to sit, hopefully get a glimpse of William in his lifetime. This became a very popular place from 1603 right through, never stronger, to the present day. As we walk through into the beautiful gardens of William Shakespeare's home.
A corta distancia de la casa paterna, en Harley Street, en el pequeño pueblo de Stratford del siglo XVI, se ubica una construcción levantada por la Orden de la Santa Cruz. El Salón de la Orden servía para menesteres de la comunidad, y es aquí donde el pequeño William Shakespeare pudo haber tenido la experiencia más profunda de su vida.
John Shakespeare, William's father, was bailiff or mayor of the town in 1568-69. And we believe that it was while he was mayor that he would have presided in the space behind me in order to give license to the travelling players who came to Stratford on a fairly regular basis. They were required to put on a performance and to gain the approval of the town council before they performed elsewhere in the town. And at this time, young William Shakespeare would have been 4 or 5 years old and could have well stood next to his father during the play's performance, and therefore would have had his first experience of acting and drama in the very space behind me.
Sería en este mismo recinto, en una sala contigua, donde aquel pequeño destinado a la inmortalidad también recibiría su instrucción.
The room which is to my front is Shakespeare's schoolroom. This was the room in which Shakespeare was taught for 7 years. He joined the new grammar school in 1571 and was taught by 2 masters. The first was Simon Hunt, and the second was a man called Thomas Jenkins, who we believe was parodied by Shakespeare in his play The Merry Wives of Windsor, where there is a character who is a Welsh schoolmaster who attempts to teach a young boy some Latin grammar. And we believe that Thomas Jenkins was the man who was parodied by Shakespeare in The Merry Wives. The curriculum would have been almost entirely Latin. From 6 o'clock in the morning until 5 o'clock in the afternoon, he would have been taught Latin by his schoolmaster, the Greek classics, the Roman classics, Roman histories, all of which Shakespeare became familiar with and would have been taught in this very room. Well, we know for certain that he left at the age of 14. We suspect for largely financial reasons. At this time, his father was in some financial difficulties and almost certainly required William to return to the family and to contribute to the family income. But it is possible that for at least part of his time, he did return to the grammar school and help to educate some of the younger boys.
Pero la curiosa mente que guiaba la vida del niño pronto sería desplazada por la inquietud juvenil.
Love is blind and lovers cannot see the petty follies that themselves commit. Shakespeare siempre fue un profundo conocedor del alma humana y sus impulsos, y él no pudo resistirse a uno de ellos, el amor, y es por ello que recorría casi más de 2 millas desde el centro de Stratford para llegar hasta esta cabaña, la cabaña de Anne Hathaway, la mujer que se convertiría en su esposa.
En la pequeña comunidad llamada Shottery vivían Richard Hathaway y su familia.
We know the age of the building. The original building is just the central stone bit you can see behind me. The sections at both ends haven't arrived yet, and that part of the building goes back to 1463. We know that because we know when the trees were cut down to build it. The family themselves, the Hathaways, come to live here in the 1540s. And when we get to the, say, 1540 itself, we know they're here because we've got documentary evidence they're living here. Records weren't very well kept back then, and Anne is a woman who don't figure greatly back then. It's a man's world. We know a lot more about Shakespeare, but she's the eldest daughter. There's 7 children in total. She's the eldest girl. So almost certainly one of her roles would have been looking after the children, helping mum. And it's a farm, so there's all the farm work to be done. Anne would help mum in the house. So there's all the cooking, cleaning, everything to do, while her father and her brothers would be out on the farm and they'd be learning to farm.
Con solo 18 años, William Shakespeare desposó a Anne Hathaway en 1582 ante la inminente llegada de su primera hija al año siguiente.
This is where she was born, and that goes back right into the 15th century. Right. So she lived here until she married Shakespeare. So Anna's lived here in the building behind me for 26 years.
Fueron 3 los hijos que William Shakespeare procreó con Anne Hathaway: Susana, que nació en 1583, y los gemelos Judith y Hamnet. Este último, único hijo varón, murió a los 11 años, presuntamente víctima de los brotes bubónicos de la época. En 1597, con una reputación ganada en la dramaturgia, Shakespeare adquirió su casa de adultez. Esa construcción ya no existe, y desde entonces ha sido un jardín.
What was here on the site of New Place was effectively a garden, a Victorian pleasure garden, when all of the land was put together in the early 1800s, because people knew this was the site of New Place, Shakespeare's adult home, which had unfortunately been demolished in 1759. So the land was put together quite early on and turned into sort of like a pleasure garden, a park if you like, and it remains a registered park and garden to this day.
The Shakespeare Birthplace Trust inició un proyecto de rescate de este predio a través de una investigación arqueológica.
It's been a really interesting project working on. It's been in process for some 2.5 years now, and the Trust is investing several £1 million into the project. But of course, one of the main things that the project has given us the opportunity to do is to do archaeology on the site for the very first time since 1759. There had been earlier archaeology right at the front of the site, but not at the rear of the site where the house proper stood.
El Dr. Paul Edmondson ha encabezado las excavaciones en Shakespeare's New Place, arrojando nueva luz a las dinámicas domésticas y la vida del autor de Hamlet.
We discovered a lot about the size of the house, that it was a very impressive dwelling in the centre of Stratford. More than that, it was the biggest house in the borough of Stratford-upon-Avon. More than that, it was the only house with a courtyard frontage to it, which, when you start to realise what that looked like, with a gatehouse at the front of the house, which you went through, and then a courtyard at the back, and then this hall here, that becomes quite interesting in terms of how theatrical perhaps the architecture is for a playwright. And also to remind ourselves that the house was about 100 years old when Shakespeare bought it. So he was buying something old-fashioned. Our archaeology showed us that Shakespeare probably rebuilt that entire front of the house because the form in which we believe it was in his time is different to the form that it had been 100 years earlier. 100 years earlier, there seemed to have been, from the archaeology, shop frontages because it belonged to a merchant, Hugh Clopton, and Shakespeare seems to have rebuilt that into something much more fashionable and much more, as it were, upwardly mobile. And this is also borne out by documentary evidence and comparative architecture.
Industrias artesanales como la elaboración de productos de consumo doméstico y grandes cantidades de malta para la elaboración de cerveza daban cuenta de la pujanza económica de este célebre habitante de Stratford. Un William Shakespeare que aparentemente dividía su existencia entre su pueblo natal y Londres.
In the context of this retelling of the life, I've been able to look at connections between Stratford-upon-Avon and London in other aspects of the time. There was a carrier who regularly took objects to and from Stratford to London. He lived just opposite Shakespeare's first family home on Henley Street. His name was William Greenaway. And all of this information is borne out in the Stratford records, the archives, which we look after at the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, but which we've been able to look again, as it were, with fresh eyes.
Pero ¿quién era William Shakespeare a los ojos de quienes lo topaban en la calle?
In terms of London and Stratford, I'd want to think in relation to your question about who did people see when they saw Shakespeare walking down the street in Stratford, and who did they see in London when they saw him walking down the street, by which I mean, what culturally did his person represent? So, for example, the Puritans, who were increasingly a presence on the Stratford Borough Council, probably saw a theatrical man who they perhaps didn't really approve of his profession. After all, the Puritans wanted the theatres to be closed in London. They didn't agree with theatre. So that reputation of something of the big city in Stratford, as Shakespeare is spending time there, you know, and perhaps in London he was seen as more provincial.
Y es en Stratford donde el cisne daría su último canto. Las causas de la muerte de William Shakespeare no son claras. Sus restos descansan en la iglesia de la Sagrada Trinidad en Stratford. Pero con el deceso del bardo, inició su permanente presencia en Stratford-upon-Avon. En el horizonte de la comunidad sobresale una torre roja, que es el actual recinto de la Royal Shakespeare Company.
The Royal Shakespeare Company, as as a theatre company has existed in a theatre here in Stratford since 1879. It was in 1960 that we became the Royal Shakespeare Company, but during that period there have been lots of different theatres created here, but most importantly the most incredible history of theatre making in the UK, with great performances that have gone down in history as the way that theatre should be presented, with performers that have then gone on to perform across the world. On the large scale, in our largest theatre here, in the Swan Theatre, our mid-scale theatre, and also in our studio theatre, the other place.
Y no obstante que ha habido en esta localidad escenificaciones de piezas de Shakespeare desde que el autor vivía, el primer registro documental de uno de sus montajes es de 1746, cuando el párroco Joseph Green organizó una función para recaudar fondos con el propósito de restaurar el monumento funerario del célebre dramaturgo.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, what's really interesting, as you will have seen, that Shakespeare can be presented in so many different ways. The stories are universal stories, so you can set them in different places. You can have actors of all types, that, as you say, culturally diverse, but every type of diversity as well, can represent the characters, because the emotions and the people and the lives they are living are completely universal.
Durante la primera década del siglo XXI, la Royal Shakespeare Company ha renovado su infraestructura. La compañía tiene una presencia regular en otras ciudades del Reino Unido, como Londres, y en giras alrededor del mundo.
We have our theatres that now look quite modern and are very large. They're very, very clear on the skyline when you come into Stratford. And of course we attract around 1 million people to these theatres alone in Stratford. Stratford has many million visitors in the year. So we're very conscious of the importance we play in the town in terms of bringing visitors in, but also explaining Stratford to visitors. We also do a lot of work in the community, so we support businesses, we work with every school in Stratford, for example. And in terms of economic impact, we think we bring at least £75 million a year of increased economic activity into the area.
Pero el reencuentro con el autor de la célebre frase «ser o no ser» también ha permitido acoger su interpretación en el contexto de un Reino Unido multicultural. Tal es el caso de una reciente versión de Hamlet. El teatro como una experiencia directa, física, de un espacio compartido, fue el entorno natural para Shakespeare. El paso del tiempo, la tecnología, traería nuevas formas de expresión, nuevos lenguajes para su profunda visión de la naturaleza humana. King John es el más antiguo registro fílmico de una obra de William Shakespeare, el primero de una larga historia en el séptimo arte.
There's over 1,000 credits, I think it's 1,100 credits for Shakespeare. And that's without all the people who have used Shakespeare or something Shakespearean in their screenplays without actually crediting him. So I think he's responsible for a huge number of film stories. So we had a very, very big canvas to look at.
To be or not to be? That is the question.
Largo ha sido el derrotero en la adaptación al cine de la obra de este autor. Desde aquellas películas que capturaban una historia cercana al montaje teatral, como la dirigida por Sir Laurence Olivier en 1948, y que empezaban a valerse de recursos como el close-up y demás encuadres. Hasta otras que en épocas más recientes hicieron una interpretación más libre, como Sueño de una noche de verano de Paul Hall. O los libros de Próspero de Peter Greenaway. Pero ¿cómo explicar esa presencia de Shakespeare en el cine?
think the penetration of Shakespeare in cinema is actually a very obvious thing. It's nothing to do with the language, actually. It's more to do with the themes. The themes of Shakespeare, we all know, they are incredibly universal. They suit their stories about passion or romance or envy or conflict or love or, you know, they're all of those things. And that suits any number of different stories. I mean, really significantly for Shakespeare on film. And I think the reason why Shakespeare has been used as the kind of base material for so many films, not just British films, not just films in the English language, but films internationally, is that he picks on subjects that are universal. They apply to everybody, whether you're here in privileged London, or you're in a refugee camp somewhere, or you know, the wilds of nowhere with no internet connection.
Something wicked this way comes.
Y aún, la historia de Shakespeare continúa en la actualidad, en manos de jóvenes creadores como el actor y director Elliot Barnes-Worrell. A partir de diferentes obras, Barnes-Worrell emplaza su película The Works en Peckham, el barrio londinense que lo vio nacer.
So The Works is a modern story told entirely through Shakespeare's words. I believe if Shakespeare was alive today, he'd be writing stories that are current today, now. His themes are current, but his places aren't, because he was writing for those times. So The Works is an estate in London, a multicultural estate in London, and everyone being affected by one incident.
We must bear.
So yeah, in stage work, I've tried to go against cultural stereotypes. So it's very common for a young black man to be cast as a bad guy, or a thug, or a gangster, or a best friend, but not the lead. I wanted to remove myself from that. There's also an idea that Shakespeare belongs to white men and rich people and elitism and academics. I also wanted to dissolve that.
Pero las inquietudes del joven creador también tienen un sesgo social.
Britain meaning a multicultural Britain, an accepting Britain, a Britain that you see in our society, in our major cities, in London, Manchester, Liverpool. Maybe not a Britain that's reflected in our politics, but in our culture, in our hearts and our souls. That's the Britain that I represent.
Actors and musicians from different ethnicities and representing different parts of the UK. So we're always conscious of the need to balance, but also to concentrate on excellence as well, and not just pay lip service to that.
No obstante, la multiculturalidad y la gama racial en torno a la obra de Shakespeare tiene una larga historia. Desde aquella primera interpretación de Otelo, en 1826, por el actor de color Ira Aldridge, hasta personajes masculinos encarnados por mujeres, como el Hamlet que Maxine Peake presentó en la producción del Royal Exchange Theatre en 2014.
Prompted to my revenge by heaven and hell.
Tony Howard, profesor de inglés y conferencista en literatura comparada de la Universidad de Warwick, realizó una exposición que ha recorrido varios lugares del Reino Unido. To Tell My Story cuenta la historia de los intérpretes de personajes shakespearianos de origen negro o asiático.
This is a very important image. It's it's a black performer from the West Indies playing the leading role in Pericles because he's a chorus, a singer and a storyteller. And so we wanted to start with that as an image of a forgotten history, because very, very few people knew about it at the time and almost no one knows about it now.
Ese actor era Edric Connor, y en 1958 se convirtió en el primer intérprete de color que se presentó en la Royal Shakespeare Company en Stratford. Connor había sido recomendado para el papel, a su vez, por el veterano Paul Robson.
He is exceptional because he was in a way almost the first person to insist that Shakespeare is about contemporary issues. He played Othello in London in 1930 when he was a very young man. He played it twice more after that. And when he did so, he gave transatlantic radio interviews where he said that this play about Othello, about racial prejudice in Venice in the 16th century, is about a black man in New York today. So Paul Robeson made the connection between politics and Shakespeare's love of freedom.
Otra de las historias es la de Errol John, un actor caribeño que emigró al Reino Unido en 1951.
This is a wonderful playwright called Errol John from the West Indies. He played Othello in the famous Old Vic Theatre in 1963. But no one knows about that. This really is one of those examples of forgotten history. Within a few months of his performance in that theatre, the same role was played by Sir Laurence Olivier. And everyone knows about that.
Pero esta exhibición, iniciada en 2012, ha contado también con el rigor académico. Cita Thomas desarrolló su tesis sobre intérpretes de Shakespeare de diferentes orígenes étnicos entre 2012 y 2015.
So I think that Shakespeare functions on a global level, on a national level, and on a personal level. So if we look globally, Shakespeare, of course, reaches around the world, around the globe. He's been translated into hundreds of different languages. He's been adapted into dozens of different mediums, and of course is performed all around the world. In terms of nationally here in Britain, he's our greatest cultural export. And then on a personal level, Shakespeare has the power to have absolute personal transformation for anyone who comes into Shakespeare, into contact with Shakespeare, whether it's through the performance, through reading, through doing. We can be transformed in terms of our horizons of expectation, of imagination and creativity.
Reiki Ayola es una actriz nacida en Gales. Ayola ha interpretado a personajes de Shakespeare y es una de las actrices que comparte su historia a través de To Tell My Story.
For me, the project illuminates the fact that lots of us come to the work for different reasons, different directions, but we can all meet in the same place. Whatever our heritage, whatever our beginnings, there's something that connects us. And I believe very strongly that although Shakespeare doesn't talk to my birth heritage, but he talks to my cultural heritage as an actor.
Pero Reiki Ayola ve en esta oportunidad un reconocimiento que va más allá del escenario.
I think what all this is about is being a part of the tradition, not finding that we disappear. So you can walk through the Royal Shakespeare Theatre, hopefully, and see 6-foot images of black women and black men, as well as Laurence Olivier. That's what it's all about. We're part of the tradition, and we're here to stay.
A lot of history, we know Shakespeare is extremely prevalent in this culture, very important to Britons and to the wider world. But the story that hasn't been told is the story of the Black and Asian performers that have contributed to the appreciation of Shakespeare and to that history. So it's incredibly important in historical terms, in terms of legacy. My generation, our generation, telling the story, stretching back to Paul Robeson, and also discussing what may be in the future.
La doctora Jamie Rogers, de la Universidad de Warwick, también participa con una base de datos que recoge la referencia de actores y actrices de diferentes orígenes étnicos.
I'm told again and again by some of the actors that we've interviewed and some that representation is key. It's if they see an actor of color on the stage doing Shakespeare, they realize that even though culturally it seems to be, the message is it's an elite art, but if they see a performer of color on the stage, they're like, oh, I can do that. I am allowed to do that. That's what I want to do.
Samir Bamra representa parte de la tradición del sureste asiático que también ha abrazado a Shakespeare. Nacido en Kenia, pero de origen británico hindú, Bamra fundó la compañía Physical, desde donde ha impreso a sus producciones el estilo de Bollywood. Con su producción de Cymbeline, él explica cómo ha tendido los puentes entre ambas tradiciones.
I try to make that work relevant to my audience. And how I do that is I find something in the narrative that I feel is connected to our experiences, our emotions, the way we've grown up, the way we are going to live our lives. For example, when I did Cymbeline, I looked at my own life. Essentially, Cymbeline is the story of a father who doesn't approve of his daughter getting married to a particular man. He's chosen a different man for her. No man is good enough for daddy's little princess. And when I looked at my own life, I just realized that when my mum got married to my dad, my grandfather absolutely hated my father.
Oh, she that bore you was no queen.
Jerónimo Veste es un actor mexicano formado en el Reino Unido, y él también percibe el cambio en el espíritu shakespeariano que llena los escenarios de la capital británica.
Se va a un enfoque del cambio que deseamos todos, ¿no? El cambio en nuestras situaciones, y en ese sentido el cambio que ha pasado esta ciudad, Londres, ¿no? Donde él vivió mucho tiempo, sí es una ciudad muchísimo más multicultural que lo que era en ese entonces, aunque también existía esa multiculturalidad y está en varias de sus obras. Creo que esa multiculturalidad aquí se está también mostrando en la escena, pero es muy reciente ahorita en cuanto a los elencos conformados por elencos multiculturales, ¿no?
Otro de los mexicanos más cercanos a Shakespeare es el doctor en literatura comparada, Alfredo Michel Modenesi.
Shakespeare no tiene llave mágica para meterse a todos lados. Esto es un poco entender que ya no estamos en la época de las cuentitas y los espejitos y el dios blanco que vino a enseñarnos. Así se manejó a Shakespeare en la época colonial británica. Es decir, llevar a Shakespeare a la India a que todos entendieran por qué somos superiores, ¿no?
Pero no solo es en las pasiones humanas, sino en la letra de sus obras, en la letra viva que pronuncia un actor, en la risa o la emoción del público, en el humor, que Shakespeare adquiere su plenitud, más allá de la lengua inglesa.
El sentido del humor exige más cercanía local, que es algo que a veces no entienden de ciertos trabajos, por ejemplo míos, que es, perdóname, mi primera misión como traductor de un chiste es hacer un chiste. Y si el chiste está basado en un juego de palabras cuyo logro depende enteramente de un giro local, lo voy a usar, porque además es para mis actores en mi comunidad.
Shakespeare no solo se monta, se lee o se declama, también se canta, y es en la música, que también ha hecho mella.
As you've said, I'm a musician originally, so I respond emotionally to the poetic side of Shakespeare, particularly the flow of the verse and the rhythm of the verse and so on, as have many creative minds, much more creative than me, over the centuries. And it's extraordinary to reflect how much music and opera has been inspired by Shakespeare.
Pero no solo han sido las manifestaciones musicales clásicas. Shakespeare ha encontrado el camino hacia las nuevas sonoridades y las generaciones más recientes a través de ritmos casi insospechados.
Uncle Carla, the flow farther. You already know that I'm smarter than half of the darker the shit get harder. I spit yet fools when I act like they can't get a quick death.
Sí,
how many careers have been ended and hate by the pound surrounds my reflection. I do this for my own protection.
Hijo de inmigrantes del Caribe, Kingsley James Daly, mejor conocido como Akala, creció en el barrio londinense de Camden. El ambiente multicultural y la música le llevaron a fundar en 2009 The Hip Hop Shakespeare Company, con ayuda del actor británico Sir Ian McKellen.
The Hip Hop Shakespeare Company had an interesting genesis. I think, one, I took my high school exit exam the year Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet came out, or around that period. I remember watching it in school and thinking, wow, this is an incredible way to reinterpret and reimagine this writer who a lot of my generation grew up thinking, oh, this guy's really boring, he's out of date, he's what they call posh in England, which of course he wasn't, but we'll get into that later. You have all of this baggage around Shakespeare, even here in the UK and the way it's taught. And I didn't have a lot of those issues because I grew up listening to such intellectual music.
Pero The Hip Hop Shakespeare Company no es solo una agrupación musical, sino un proyecto escénico y educativo integral.
And DJ challenged me to fit the titles of 27 Shakespeare plays into a freestyle on One Extra in 2007. And I did that, luckily, in 10 minutes. And it really solidified what I was trying to do. I was already working on an educational format. Then I came up with the idea of just taking the best quotes from hip hop artists and the best quotes from Shakespeare and challenging people to tell the difference. And so that was the original game, and then the game worked really effectively. And then eventually in 2009, after kind of a year of testing out our workshop format in 2008, we launched as a company with a mission statement to not just do educational workshops, so that's a heavy part of what we do, educational residencies, but also live events, productions, all kinds of educational and arts offerings around combining hip hop and Shakespeare, and new ways of expressing and reimagining those forms on the stage and on the page, as it were.
It's not just about reflecting the past, but also about connecting with the contemporary generation through music that is inspired by Shakespeare. So music is another way in, I think. Sometimes people are attracted by paintings or by literature and so on, but music is another connection point for those whose instinct is musical maybe rather than literary.
There goes preaching again. A caller, stick to the script, just stun. Tell him about your whip, brand new something.
The challenge to teaching anything that is challenging, Shakespeare is challenging. There's no doubt about that. The way in which he uses language is difficult. But it's always worth remembering that he was one of the most popular entertainers of his day, and that the vast majority of his audience at the time could not read or write. He was, the popular, particularly towards the end of his life, the popular playwright of his times. So I think it's about the way in which we use the natural gifts that are in Shakespeare's text. Rhythm is a heavy central component of all Shakespearean texts.
Este 400 aniversario luctuoso de William Shakespeare, caracterizado por un amplio programa de actividades en el Reino Unido y a través de todo el mundo, organizado por el British Council, celebrando así la vida y la obra de quien es quizá uno de los autores más importantes de todos los tiempos.